All right, hello everybody. I'm David Wilsey. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Balanced Scorecard Institute. I wanted to welcome you to our webinar entitled "The 3 Things Organizations Must Do to Achieve Success." This webinar is a first in a series we will be doing as a preview of our second annual Strategy Execution Summit, which will occur on May 19th through the 21st at the Park Hyatt in Washington, D.C. This international event is hosted by the Balanced Scorecard Institute and Spider Strategies and will feature strategy execution's thought leader Jerome DeFlander and online privacy expert Jules Polonetsky as keynote speakers. Our webinar host today, Dr. Gardner Shaw, will also be featured at the conference as he's presenting on the end of strategy. Many of you probably already know Gardner as one of the folks who helped create our professional certification program. He's also the lead instructor for both the BSMP application course and the BSMP 10-day course. I'm going to hand things off to Gardner now, but he's going to first go through a quick overview of the 3 things that you need to be doing to achieve success, and then we're going to open the door for some questions and discussion. When we get to that point, please use the questions interface in the GoToWebinar interface to ask questions. Let's test it out, just so everybody's comfortable with that. To test, first, instead of asking a question, let's all type in an answer to this simple question. Do you currently use a balanced scorecard? You can simply type in yes or no and then hit send, or if it's more complicated than that, you're more than welcome to share a quick description of your current status. All right, here they come. I see them trickling in. Very good. Sort of. All right, very good. So we see a mix of yeses and nos, and then we've got a few. I'm alert for the possibility. A couple of complications. Okay. So Gardner, the end of strategy. It sounds like at the end of your presentation at the conference, we can all just pack up and go home.
Actually, that title is somewhat ambiguous, and it's around the ambiguity that the discussion at the conference is actually going to be centered. You know, partly you think about the notion of end as exactly what you said. Now we're done, we can go home and don't have to do anything else. Or the other way to think about the end is the end you have in mind. You know, what's the purpose that you're trying to accomplish? And if your concern is with the purpose you're trying to accomplish, by the time you finish putting together a strategy, you're really just ready to get started. And that's what we'll be talking about at the conference.
Okay.
Okay, is my screen up now?
It is.
Okay, good. Good day, everyone. I'm glad to have you all join us today. What I'd like to do is share a few thoughts with you about an issue that I'm sure is of major concern to all of you, or you wouldn't be here, and that is, what do you need to do to help your organization achieve a successful future? And let me just dwell on that idea of achieving a successful future for a second, because to me that's what this is all about. You know, we're not concerned about having a good strategic plan or about having a good balanced scorecard or whatever. The whole point of this is, what do we need to do to achieve a successful future? And I'm sure all of you, day in and day out, are faced with questions about, should we do this, should we do that, how should we do something in order to be most successful? I think you'll find that the 3 points we're going to be talking about today, focus, alignment, and execution, will really help to take what can be a very complicated and contentious and confusing set of issues you face on a day-to-day basis and give you a means of arriving at smart decisions about why we should go a particular way rather than another way, why we should choose one choice rather than another choice, and also give you the basis for communicating to other people why that is the choice that makes sense and why it's in their best interest to help you move in that direction. So we're going to be talking about these 3 points: focus, alignment, and execution. To get this out of consultant speak for a second, what do I mean by those 3 terms? Well, first of all, what I mean by focus is that we have a clear shared understanding of where we're going and how we intend to get there. Now you may think about that as, well, maybe that's the organization's vision. That's fine. But the point is, we have a sense of where we're trying to take the organization. What do we need to do to be successful 5 years from now, which is probably not just what we need to do to be successful today, the things we're already doing. So that's what I mean by focus, is where are we trying to take the organization. Alignment is the question of, are we all pulling in the same direction? Are we all doing the things that we need to be doing individually and as teams to help accomplish that clear shared focus of where we're trying to go? We can have a focus and we have an alignment, and that's not enough, because then we have to have some execution. You know, once we are clear on where we want to go and we have everybody prepared to move in the right direction, we actually have to start doing things. We need to do the right things, and we need to do those things right. And I think what you'll find is that if you constantly refer back to these 3 points, focus, alignment, and execution, as you're working through the process in your organization, you find that these are going to help to keep you on track, and it's going to help make the whole process make a lot more sense to many of the people that you're dealing with. So moving along a second, why do I say these are critical? Well, what if we don't have any one or more than one of these items? Suppose we don't have focus. What does that mean? We're not all thinking about the same future. We're not all moving in the same direction. So we have confusion. You know, we're doing things, people don't understand why we're doing them. We have a particular initiative. People don't see the point of that initiative. We have a diluted effort because people are doing different things for different reasons aimed toward different ends. I mean, that's where we are if we lack focus. You know, I invite you to think about the organization you're in or organizations you have been with in the past and see how often is that a problem. Certainly I've seen that a serious issue in many organizations is simply that first piece not being there, a lack of focus. Second is the question of alignment. Maybe we do have a clear sense of where we're supposed to be going, but if we're not all working toward that same objective, if we don't all understand what our role in that is, then what's going to happen? We're going to have fragmented efforts. People are going to do one thing, another group of people are going to do something else. We're going to be sub-optimizing because we're going to do one thing really well, but at the expense of doing something else poorly that was just as important. We're going to have people competing for resources in order to make themselves or their function look good, rather than working toward the overall good of the entire organization and its future. So if we don't have alignment, we're going to have a serious problem. Many organizations, I think, have serious alignment problems because of the way they do things like rewards and recognition in the organization. You know, if you're only rewarded or recognized for what you or your particular piece of the organization does, then there is very little incentive to work toward an alignment, toward a common focus for the overall organization. Well, suppose you have a good focus, and you do have pretty good alignment, and that's all you have. Well, then what do you have? You probably have a nice strategic plan that's probably sitting on a shelf somewhere, and nothing is really happening because of it. So just getting the right words on paper, just getting arrows and bubbles that point in the right direction may look like good focus and alignment, but it doesn't necessarily produce execution. So we're going to have to figure out, how do we actually execute those things we said we need to do in order to get us where we want the organization to go. Many of you have been down part of this road already, and if you've done it well, then here's what I would suggest you probably have done so far. In our planning process, what do we do to try to develop and achieve and communicate focus? Well, obviously the mission of the organization and the vision of the organization are major elements of focus. You know, the mission, what business are we in? What's the purpose we serve? What value do we provide to the people we serve? Our vision, where do we need to be in the future in order to be successful? You know, these things ought to be part of our planning process. They ought to be part of our strategy. And if we've done a good job, then they are. Closely tied to that is the issue of customer value proposition. What is it that we offer to those we serve, whether these are commercial customers, whether these are citizens or taxpayers for government agencies, whether these are the people that not-for-profit organizations serve? In what way are we trying to make their life better or easier? What is that customer value proposition that makes it worthwhile for them to engage with us and do business with us? And then finally, when we've, in our own strategy, identified where are we trying to go, what business are we in, what's the value we are supposed to offer, where do we really need to focus our efforts? What are the areas in which we need to excel that are going to move us positively in that direction? And that's what we would typically refer to as strategic themes and the results of those strategic themes. So if you've done a good job so far, you have a well-crafted, well-thought-out mission vision, you have thought clearly about what the value is you bring to your customers, and you've thought about what are those areas in which you need to focus your efforts and excel. You've got focus. What do we do in our typical good planning process about alignment? Well, many of you probably have strategy maps, which do what for you? Well, they say here are the things we need to do that taken together will help each other and will help to accomplish the overall vision of the organization. They're saying what are the building blocks and how do those building blocks lead to success for the organization. And those strategy maps are what? They're made up of objectives. They're made up of more specific items that we need to accomplish to be successful. And we think about them first at the global level, at the corporate level, at the agency-wide level. But then as we move forward, we take them down a notch. We say, okay, how about the operating units? How about the regions? How about business units? What are the things they need to do to help the overall organization succeed? So we're cascading those objectives. This is aligning that level of unit with the higher level strategy of the organization as we've seen it, for example, in a strategy map. And another piece in alignment, we're going to say, what are the initiatives we have in place? What are the things we're doing to try to improve our capacity to be exceptional, to work well, to achieve what we're trying to achieve? We make sure that those initiatives that we put in place are linked to the strategy as we've described it in our objectives, in our maps, in our themes, and so forth. So all of these pieces are tied together within our strategy. If we've done these things, then our plan should have done a good job of creating focus and creating alignment. Wish it were always such, right? It isn't necessarily, is it? Sometimes we find we really don't have good focus in the organization. Well, just a couple of examples of some of the many problems you may encounter in the area of focus. One of the problems may be that we decided on a future without doing a thorough analysis of our likely future environment. Now, let me give you kind of a classic example. An organization that sets as its vision for the future, we want to be world-class X. We want to be the best at Y. Well, these are fine, fine objectives, but they don't really say what is going to be different about the world 3 years or 4 years or 5 years from now that you need to be able to respond to. How is technology going to have changed? How is the environment going to have changed? How's the financial situation likely to be different? How is your customer base likely to have changed? Your focus needs to take account of what you need to do to navigate through that changing environment as things are going to evolve over coming years. So we need to have done a good analysis of what that future environment is likely to be before we've even tried to say what we think our role in that future needs to be. So what's the new approach? We do a thorough, rigorous assessment. We bring in experts to look at what are the changes we're likely to face as an organization, both internally and externally. We have that assessment available to senior leaders when they're trying to identify where we need to go, and we keep it in front of people all the time as we're adding detail to the process, as we're talking more and more about how we're actually going to execute this. We don't just do a one and done, few people sit around the table and say, what do we think the environmental scan looks like? And an hour later, we're done, and we never look at it again. We do a thorough assessment, and we keep that in front of people throughout the process, month in and month out, year in and year out. So we're always keeping in mind, here's the situation we think we need to deal with. Another problem, we failed to identify appropriate strategic themes and results. Again, I don't want to get into too much consultant speak. What I'm saying is we failed to identify a few key areas that we really needed to focus our efforts in and that we needed to excel in. Okay, so we need to identify if we do this and this, these are things that are going to move us toward accomplishing that intended future. We ought to be able to identify some areas that we need to focus on that are going to cause us to be different in a couple of years than we are now. It's not just a matter of doing more, better, faster. It's saying, what are the things we need to do differently if we want to be successful tomorrow rather than just today? How about alignment? A couple issues here. We have a strategy, but it doesn't show a clear line from the strategic actions we take, for example, our strategic objectives, to our future success. That is to say, the vision we're trying to accomplish. I can't tell you how many things called strategy maps I've looked at. When I looked at the objectives on that strategy map, the things that people said they needed to do simply looked like a system diagram. It simply identified, here's the stuff we do today, and here's how these things tie together. What they don't often do is show, here are a couple of particular areas that we really need to work hard at that are going to cause us to be in a different place in a few years than we are now. Your strategy map needs to be strategic. There need to be elements in that strategy map that say, here's what's going to be different about what we do that's going to lead us to a better place in the future. Another problem with alignment: different functions and initiatives having different focuses. Very often, some of these focuses have come up from different parts of our organization's mission, different parts of our history. They're focused on different customers. They're focused on different purposes. The people in charge of them are rewarded as individuals. They're not rewarded as part of a team. What do we need to do? We need to make sure, if we want to have alignment, that the entire leadership team of the organization works as a team, and that they work as a team with a common focus. You're not going to get good alignment if all the members of the senior leadership team are going off in their own individual directions, being rewarded only for their own individual or organization component behavior. So those are a couple of common problems I've seen in alignment, and I hope that this gives you a chance to think about some of that. What I'd like to do is pause here for just a minute and ask you to think about your own organization. See some questions posed up there. How clear is your focus in your organization? Is that focus understood throughout the organization? How well is your strategy aligned around that focus? So what I'd like to do is ask you to take just a couple minutes to go into the polling process that David is going to set up for you, respond to each of those 3 questions, and then I'd like to take the responses to those and see where the areas are that most of you who are on the line are experiencing problems in your organization. So we'll go back and talk about some of those things in a little bit more detail. So, okay, David, let me kick it over to you and ask folks to respond to the poll.
Okay. The first question: how clear is your focus? So if everybody could just select one of these options: very clear, somewhat clear, not really clear, definitely not clear. And it seems, as they're trickling in, it looks like somewhat clear is definitely the leader. Okay, about another 5 seconds or so. All right, so it looks like, Gardner, what we're coming out with is about 21% very clear, 55% somewhat clear. Let me show the results to everybody. 21% ended up at very clear, 55% somewhat clear, 20% not really clear, and only 5% definitely not clear. All right. So that's poll number 1. The second one is that focus understood throughout your organization? And again, our options are very understood, somewhat understood, not very understood, and definitely not understood. All right, I'll give you about another 5 more seconds. Looks like most people are voting. All right, and so it looks like we've got 9% at very understood, 48% at somewhat understood, 37% at not really understood, and 7% definitely not understood. Okay, so it's again in the second or third option. Okay, the third question: how well aligned are the components of your strategy? very aligned, somewhat aligned, not really aligned, or definitely not aligned. All right, another 4 or 5 seconds. All right, it looks like we're at 10%, very aligned, 51% somewhat aligned, 32% not really aligned, and 8% definitely not aligned.
Okay, David, thanks, and thanks all of you for for sharing your own perceptions of where your organization is with this. Let me just offer a couple of quick observations about what these results suggest to me. Number one is there's a fairly good representation of folks who are doing either very well or pretty well. And, surprise, surprise, here you are, continuing to try to get further education and more information and do some more networking around how to move your organization forward. So, the fact that you particular folks are online would lead me to think, yeah, these are people who know something pretty serious about what they're doing and, just trying to move it up an additional notch beyond where they are now. A lot of people, to be sure, are kind of somewhere in the middle from pretty good to not as good as we'd like to be. So certainly room for improvement. Some of you are clearly early on really struggling, and I can only encourage you to just keep looking for sources and keep looking for information and keep finding ways to increase yours and your organization's knowledge about what you're trying to accomplish. Well, let me look at the 3 individual questions and talk a little bit more about each of these. It seems to me that the second one is the focus understood throughout the organization is the one that overall had probably the weakest positive response. 48% said somewhat and 37% said, not so good. So let's just talk about a couple things related to how you can go about getting the focus understood throughout the organization. And I think probably in talking about that, I'm going to bleed back into how to get the focus clear as well just a little bit. One of the things I want to bring out first about the issue of how well the focus is understood is the question of who has been involved in developing and understanding and executing the work you need to do to accomplish that focus. One of the problems I think many organizations encounter is that the focus is developed, as I believe it should be, by the senior leadership of the organization, but it is often not communicated as well by the senior leadership as it needs to be. More importantly, I think it's essential that the overall direction of the organization must come from the top. But the details of how we're going to accomplish that overall direction, what are we actually going to do on a day-to-day basis, what are the processes we need to improve, what are the initiatives we need to undertake, how are we going to get there, are things that need broad participation and broad input from around the organization. If you approach the process of developing and executing strategy by involving as many people from as many parts of the organization as you can as you go along, then every time you involve a new set of people in the process, there are going to be more people who understand what the focus is, why it is, and what they're supposed to be bringing to the table to help you accomplish that. So I think just continually looking for ways to actively involve more and more people in what you're trying to accomplish is a good way to help the focus be better understood throughout the organization. But you can't do it all on just word of mouth from one person to the other. There are certainly things you need to be doing that are going to get the word out to everybody. It needs to be not just one way, though. It needs to be a two-way communication. You need to think of as many possible forums as possible where you can communicate where are we trying to go, how are we trying to get there, what's your role going to be in accomplishing this stuff. And think about this for a second. If that message about what is the focus of the organization comes from just your immediate supervisor, and you never hear anyone higher in the organization talking about that, how seriously are you going to take that? How convinced are you going to be that that really is the big organizational focus? If we really want people to understand that this is where the organization is trying to go, and you need to help, that really needs to be a message that comes from the senior-most people in the organization, and it needs to come across many ways and in a lot of different ways. So we need to be looking at how are the different ways we can have the senior members of the organization talking about where we're trying to go and how you can help us get where we're trying to go. It's also a matter of these people who are the leaders of the organization, who people historically have probably thought about the leaders of our operations, also being seen as the leaders of our strategy. They need to be communicating to people that our strategy of what we need to do to get from where we are today to where we want to be in the future is every bit as important as doing a good job on the day-to-day work, the day-to-day processes that we have in place now. So those would be a couple things I would suggest would help us to get the focus more clearly understood. Let me mention a little bit on the third point, the alignment around the focus. I think this is very much a matter of, do you do the process in the right way? If you start with the end in mind, if you begin with where is the vision of the organization taking us, what do we want to be in the future, what do we need to do to be successful 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road, if we begin with the end in mind and then build everything around what we need to do to get us there, then it's going to just naturally help us to align pieces. We start with what do we want to look like in 3 years. And then we say, well, what are the areas in which we need to excel that are going to move us in that positive direction? And then we say, well, what are the building blocks that will help us to accomplish those key themes, those areas in which we need to excel? What are the building blocks? The building blocks now are built around the areas we need to excel. The things we're doing to excel are building toward accomplishing what the overall focus, the vision of the organization is. As we take it further down in the organization, we say, what does, the different business units, the different regions, the different departments need to do? These are all built in support of what we have already put in place. So if you start at the top, if you start with the end in mind, I think you'll find that the strategy itself will end up being well aligned. Now, in a couple minutes, we're going to talk about not so much the alignment of the strategy as the alignment of the organization components, and that's a slightly different issue. But to get the strategy aligned, you simply need to start with the end in mind and build down as you go. Okay, I'd like to just pause here for a second and see if there are any specific questions that any of you want to pose around either the issue of focus or alignment at this point. And I'll let David take a look at those, and we may take a minute to respond to a couple of those questions right now. So let me pass it over to you.
Yeah, if you have any questions, just ask the questions on the questions panel on your GoToWebinar interface. Let's see, and we will have an opportunity for more questions later on as well. One question: what if you're struggling with political differences between departments in an organization, Gardner?
I think you need to partly look at what are the reasons for those political differences. If the reasons for the political differences is that they serve different customer bases or different subsets of your customer base or your clientele, you really need to get those people together around the same table with the senior-most person in the organization and decide it is just not acceptable for us to be fighting with each other for resources when we have an overall mission of the organization which we need to execute. I think many of those questions about political differences come down to the fact that in too many organizations that I've seen, you have a situation in which the senior leader of the organization meets individually with his or her direct reports, and they're almost treated as though those different divisions or different regions or different areas of the organizations are almost independent fiefdoms. You really need to get beyond that, and this is only going to happen if you get the senior leaders all working together on a regular basis as a team under the senior-most person with a clear sense of what our common purpose is, not what our individual purpose. Another thing that I think often reinforces this notion of political differences is how do we actually reward and recognize the senior leadership of the organization? Are they rewarded for how well their department or division did or how well their region did and only for that? Or are they rewarded for what their contribution was of their unit to the overall success of the organization? I mean, if you look, as I have, at many organizations' compensation plans and bonus plans, we are rewarding people for setting up walls between their part of the organization and other parts of the organization. And we're not rewarding people for tearing down those walls. So we really need to look at what are the things that reinforce that kind of behavior. Not only what creates them, but what do we do on a regular basis inadvertently to reinforce those kind of problems.
Okay, let's see. Laura asks, how do you assess the understanding of the focus? Do you use a survey?
I think you probably want to get at it in several different ways. Certainly a survey is a useful way to do it, because what the survey does is gives you information about the broad number of people in the organization and what their understanding of the focus might be. On the other hand, surveys have a lot of obvious limitations, so I wouldn't want to rely exclusively on a survey. That's giving you, a lot of breadth of understanding. Things like individual meetings, team meetings, where you're simply asking people in those meetings, something like a focus group, or often, a generic or organic kind of organizational unit, talking about what do we understand the focus to be. Ask people to express what they believe that to be in their own words. And that gives the leaders of those organizational units a chance to see, do people really get it or are they confused? So that approach of dealing with people face-to-face directly gives you a depth of understanding, whereas a survey gives you a breadth of understanding. And there are different techniques of doing both of those things, the face-to-face and basically survey kind of response. But I think you really do need to do both in order to get a good handle on how good that understanding is.
All right, maybe one more, and then we'll go on to the next section, and we'll come back to the questions at the end. I would like to know, Bruce asks, I would like to know how detailed or complex the strategy map tools should be. Most of what he has seen are what he thinks are much too basic.
I think you need to be very cautious with developing strategy maps. Number one, to make sure that they do capture the most important strategic elements you're trying to put in place. They should not be systems diagrams. They should not describe everything that the organization does. They should describe what are the key areas in which you need to be working and concentrating your efforts in order to move forward. I'm much more distressed by overly complicated strategy maps than I am by overly simplified strategy maps. What I would worry about with one being too simple is if it's not only simple, but it is also not talking about anything very important. If you had a strategy map with only 8 or 10 objectives on it, but several of those 8 or 10 objectives were clearly strategic activities that you needed to do to change where the organization is going or how it's going to get there, I think that's fine. That's helping people to focus. You get too complicated, too much detail, and it really dissipates the focus, and people have a hard time understanding where you're trying to go with this. Keep in mind that there are going to be multiple levels at which you can do this work. I would rather see a relatively simple but highly strategic strategy map at the highest level of the organization, supplemented by additional strategy maps at lower levels of the organization, none of which individually is overly complicated. But if you take together that whole suite of strategy maps from different levels of the organization, you have the opportunity to really get into the level of detail that I suspect Bruce is asking you to try to get to. I just wouldn't try to do it all in one big graphic.
Now, Ariona asked a question about the alignment of organizational components, and I think that you're going to get into that a little bit more in this next section.
That's right, I will.
So,
okay, shall we move on?
Sure.
Okay. So what we've talked about so far of the 3 points that we had identified at the beginning, the focus, the alignment, and execution, mostly we've been talking so far about focus and alignment. So now let's talk more about the issue of execution. Of course, the first question is, who are we going to execute? No, that's not the question, I'm sorry. To successfully execute our strategy, what do we need to do to make this stuff happen and to make it successful? Well, I identify, again, simple number 3 imperatives. What do we need to do? First of all the people in the organization need to be involved and supported in what we're doing. Okay, this can't be something that's only done by the senior leadership. It can't be something that's only done by a strategy office. We have to have broad participation from around the organization in what we're doing to try to get us from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. Second is all of our systems and processes are aligned. All the things we do in the organization need to be moving in the same direction, helping to take us toward accomplishing that intended future, that desired state of success we want to get to. Most importantly, senior leaders lead. Senior leaders lead the strategy. So let's talk about each of these 3 points. First, all people are involved and supported. The organization is characterized by effective teamwork and collaboration to execute the strategy. People work together, and they work together as teams. And what are some of the things we need to do to get there? First of all, we need to have good, consistent, two-way communication, both face-to-face, through electronic media. However, we need to have the opportunity for people to express themselves and to get feedback from other people about what they've expressed, whether this is from high in the organization to lower in the organization or across organizational boundaries. We need to have good, consistent, two-way communication. We want to be using this to build consensus around where we're trying to go and how we're trying to get there and what people need to do to accomplish that. Certainly we could, come in and impose our will on folks, and for a while that will probably work. But in the long run, people are going to work hard at the things that they believe in. So we want to get to the point where people believe in what they're doing and why they're doing it, and that's, to me, what we're talking about with consensus. Not many people expect everything to be done exactly the way they want it to be done. But most people are willing to go along with things that say, okay, if the majority thinks that's the right way to do it, I'm willing to contribute in an active way to help accomplish that common objective. But we need to have a vehicle for testing consensus and for testing consensus on a regular basis to make sure that we do have people on board with this. A lot of this issue of all people being involved and supported means that we first need to recognize that when we go beyond being an operationally focused organization to a strategically focused organization, we're going to be asking a lot of people to do things they have not done before. And in some cases, we're going to be asking them to do things that they may initially find to be threatening. Well, part of the way we can help to overcome that is to have timely, appropriate training to make sure that when we're asking people to do something new or something different, they actually know how to do that. They start to get a comfort level with doing something they have not done before. And, I can think about this, at any level of the organization. Many people often think, well, I need to, give people training in how to use the new customer relationship management system. Yeah, sure, that would be an example. But we're also going to be asking senior leaders to do very different kinds of things as well. We're going to be asking them to act as a team. We're going to be asking them to talk about strategy, not operations. So there's a lot of things that, frankly, the senior leadership is going to need timely, appropriate training for, not just the people throughout the other levels of the organization. And if we want people involved and supported, we have to have constructive rewards and recognition. I can't say this too many times in too many different ways. If we really want to have an organization that operates differently as we move into the future, we need to look at what were the things that reinforce the way we have always behaved in the past, and we're going to need to find ways of changing some of those things. And some of the most important ways that we have reinforced past behavior is by either the formal or the informal ways that we reward and recognize people's behavior. If we want people to behave differently in the future, we're going to need to change the way we do those things. We need to stop just rewarding individual performance and start rewarding team performance. We need to stop not just recognizing people who have put out fires, but recognize people who have avoided fires starting in the first place. So we need to think about what can we do at the top level of the organization and on a peer-to-peer basis in the organization to reward and recognize the appropriate kind of behaviors to have teamwork toward moving towards the future we want to get to. Okay, let's move on to the second point. Systems and processes are aligned. If you're like many organizations, especially organizations of very much size, there's a lot of stuff going on in the organization. You've got various kinds of initiatives, you've got projects, they may be IT projects, they may be personnel, human resource projects, they may be construction projects. You've got a variety of different business units in the organization who have slightly different ways that they contribute to the overall effort. They have slightly different missions, if you will. We've got the budget process, okay? We've got human resource processes, such as how do we decide who to promote in the organization? How do we decide who to financially compensate and by how much? We have the core processes by which we do the major work of the organization. It is really, really easy, unfortunately, for an organization that's concerned about setting itself on a course for a successful future to think that all they need to do is think about strategy and their strategy maps and their strategic plan and have those things look good without looking over at all the rest of these things that are happening in the organization at the same time. These other initiatives, what the business units themselves are doing, what the budget process looks like. All these different functional areas need to be aligned around the direction the organization is trying to move. All the initiatives you pursue need to have some direct link to accomplishing that intended future. The work of all the business units needs to recognize what is their contribution to accomplishing that overall successful future. The budget process needs to occur in chronological order that allows it to capture the strategy that has been developed and incorporate that strategy in the budget. The performance appraisal process for individuals needs to take place at a time that you can have identified what you need to have the organization do before you define what the individuals need to be doing in support of that. So part of this process is getting things to occur in the proper sequence over the course of the year. When do you decide on budget? When do you decide on performance appraisal? When do you decide on initiatives and so forth? Get these things to occur in a logical building process so that one feeds directly into the other, so that they're naturally aligned simply in terms of time sequence. But the other thing I need to think about alignment is that I don't have things that are creating incentives around supporting initiatives or managing business units or managing core processes that create incentives for the individuals managing those things to go off in their own direction, to go off in a direction that is contradictory or competitive with the overall focus of the organization. So I constantly need to be looking at, have I done things that are creating incentives for people to get out of alignment and stay out of alignment? Okay. Let's talk finally about the issue of senior leaders lead. The senior leadership team and its members provide active, personal, and visible leadership of our strategy. First and foremost, they need, if they don't currently do so, to learn to operate as a team. You're not going to get where you need to go if the leadership style is the boss meets with his or her direct reports individually from time to time. They need to sit down with each other face to face, and if they haven't done that historically, it's going to be painful for a while until they can get used to it. You may need to get a facilitator in there or a referee or whatever, but they need to learn to talk to each other as a team, and they need to talk about strategy as a team. They have to have a clear focus themselves. They have to have arrived at that clear focus together by operating as a team to decide what that focus needs to be. And then they need to think about what they need to do as a leadership team to reinforce that focus on a regular basis with everybody else in the organization. And that leads you to the next point, highly visible and personal engagement. They are constantly talking about and asking questions about and doing things related to accomplishing the clear focus of the organization, moving the organization toward the future that they have said is most important. And then finally, it's, talking the talk, now it's walking the walk. They need to be personally accountable, and they need to have ownership for major components of the organization's strategy, for major parts of what the organization is doing to move forward into a successful future. That means they need to be owners of high-level corporate agency-wide strategic objectives. They are the person who needs to make sure that the things that need to get done to accomplish those objectives are actually getting done. Not that they do them themselves, but they are constantly looking at the key components of your strategy and making sure that those pieces are getting done. And they are personally, individually, by name, associated with different parts of that strategy. So that's just a few of the things that need to happen in order for the senior leaders to successfully lead. And I think if you look at that list of just 4 bullet items, you can see why I made the comment earlier that sometimes the senior leaders need training just as much as everybody else does, because there's parts of this that are perhaps not part of what they're accustomed to doing. Here's the problem that a lot of senior leaders deal with. You often get promoted to a senior leadership position because you have been really good at doing and managing operations. I mean, that's your sweet spot. That's where you've made your reputation. You're an operational person, but now we're asking you to start thinking and acting strategically, and that's not something that you either were asked to do in the past, and it's not something you were trained to do previously. So we need to recognize that on the part of many of the members of the senior leadership team and figure out how can we give them the support in order to get them comfortable with taking on this new and critically important role for the organization. So those are just a few key things we need to do in the execution part. I'd like to do the same thing we did a few minutes ago and ask you to think about, again, the question of how is your organization doing in these areas. And you can see the poll questions. We're going to do the same thing as we did a few minutes ago. I'd like to ask you to think about, are all the people in your organization involved and supported? Are all the systems and processes aligned? Are the senior leaders engaged, and is their leadership visible? And you'll have a scale to answer on each of those. And then finally, among those 3 areas, people, systems, and senior leaders, which of these areas are we weakest? So I'm going to pass this over to David and ask him to conduct the poll, and he will give us feedback after you folks have had a chance to respond. Thanks. David?
Okay. All right, so the first question, are all people involved and supported? First option is very involved and supported, and then the second is somewhat involved and supported. Not really involved and supported, definitely not involved and supported. Okay, and the votes are flooding in. By the way, we had 539 people registered for this webinar, and so I realized we didn't get to everybody's questions earlier. We will send around all of the questions with at least a short answer for them, so that you can feel that we at least got to your question at some point. All right, another second or two. Looks like most people have come in. Let's look at the results. All right, 6% said very involved and supported. 55% said somewhat involved and supported. 35% said not really involved and supported. And 4% said definitely not involved and supported. All right, so then are all systems and processes aligned? Let's try this one. Very aligned, somewhat aligned, not really aligned, or definitely not aligned. And the answers are flooding in. Okay, this one is not as, this seems to be a weakness. We have more people voting for not really aligned so far. Another 5 or 6 seconds. Okay. So here's the answer, the results. 1%. Very aligned. Only 39% somewhat aligned. 52% not really aligned. And 8% definitely not aligned. Okay, so that one's definitely a weaker area compared to the others. Okay. Are senior leaders engaged, and is their leadership visible? Very engaged, somewhat engaged, not really engaged, definitely not engaged. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay. So in this case, our leaders are doing a little bit better. We've got 13% at very engaged and 54% at somewhat engaged. 29% not really engaged. 3% definitely not engaged. Okay, so not as bad as the previous question. Okay, and then finally, which area are you weakest? Which area is your organization weakest? Getting all people involved and supported, getting all systems and processes aligned, getting senior leaders visibly engaged. All right, about a couple more seconds. All right, so as expected, based on the previous questions, 35% said getting all people involved and supported, 47% said getting all systems and processes aligned, and 18% said getting senior leaders visibly engaged. Okay? Now, as I pass things back over to Gardner, let me just mention, we've got about 8 more minutes, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we'll let Gardner finish up, and then we'll take some more questions, and as I said earlier, we will send out answers to the questions in an email later.
Okay, David, thank you, and thanks to all of you for responding to these questions. Let me point out, this not only helps us to know what to talk about in the little time we have today, but also helps us to think about what do we need to be doing to try to help organizations like yours going forward with some of the things we do. Okay, well, let's talk first, obviously, about this question of are all systems and processes aligned, since that clearly is the kind of the sore spot of the 3 areas we've talked about in execution. Let me go back to the issue of senior leadership and the senior leadership team. Now, that sounds like I'm changing the subject, right? Well, I'm really not, because I think one of the keys to getting all of your systems and processes aligned is having the senior-most people in the organization sitting around the table with each other, recognizing where there is a lack of alignment and recognizing the importance of solving those alignment processes and making sure that these different initiatives and these different budget or human resource processes are all actually working toward a common goal. If we allow people who are managing those processes to operate in a vacuum and to all operate independently of each other, then they're just going to go their own direction, as well as they can, but they're going to be doing it with blinders on. So a lot of this problem of getting the systems and processes aligned begins at the very top of the organization by making sure that the people who are the leaders and the owners of all those systems and processes are themselves aligned. If the senior leaders, if the senior leadership team, the 6 or 8, at most 10 topmost people in the organization all agree on where we're trying to go as an organization and what it's going to take to get there, they will immediately recognize when somebody says, wait a second, how come we're doing the budget process in March if we're not actually thinking about next year's strategy issues until June? How can we build our strategy into the budget if we're doing these things totally out of sync? Or are they going to ask, how can we make the human resources processes, especially things like performance appraisal, really support our strategy if we're doing the performance appraisals before we've thought about the strategy? So, they can recognize some of the obvious glitches simply in the sequencing of the things that go on, but they will also be able to recognize what are some of the problems with the intended outcomes of these different initiatives and these different processes. Where are we trying to go with these things? So getting the senior people talking about how do these things all need to support what our common goals and our common focus is, I think is one of the most important parts of this. But we just need to recognize what are all these things we put a lot of energy into in the organization, and we're constantly putting a lot of time into, and are those really moving us in the direction that we want our strategy to be taking us, or are they going off in their own separate directions independently, using resources, using time, but not really taking us any closer to where we need to be going in the future? I think that's probably as much as they need to say. I'm kind of concerned about the time. I sometimes talk more than I should, don't I, David? So let me stop there with that particular question and pass it back to you for just a second if you'd like.
Sure. Just so you know, like I said, we'll send a note around with an answer to your questions. If you'd like to pick our brains in person, Gardner and I will both be presenting at the Strategy Execution Summit in Washington, D.C. on May 19th through the 21st. we will both be presenting, and there's a lot of opportunities over lunch and coffee and that sort of thing to meet with not only the two of us but all of our consultants and ask all these questions that you might have. And then if you do want more information or you want to get training on this, don't forget that especially for all of you that have our Balanced Scorecard Professional certification already, that Gardner teaches our BSMP application class in March on March 16th through the 20th in the DC area. And then we have our 10-day program for the if you want to become a Balanced Scorecard Master Professional in a 10-day concentrated course rather than taking a series of courses. Gardner teaches that class as well in August 3rd through the 14th.
Yeah, and I would mention to folks that both the application course in March and also the 10-day BSMP course in August have more concentration and more detail on some of the same execution issues we've been talking about today. So we will go into those topics in more detail in both of those forums. The other thing I wanted to mention to folks is that we have components of courses and we have a webinar that deal with strategy execution, but we've been giving serious thought to the idea of a standalone course of 2 or 3 days that was focused entirely around these issues related to execution that we've been talking about today. And one of the things that would be very helpful to us would be to get some feedback from you folks about whether a course like this would be of interest to you, whether this is something you would be likely to attend if it were available. We're not asking you to register, we're just trying to get a sense of, how interested would people be in getting this kind of help from Balanced Scorecard Institute. So when we sign off, there will be a survey question that simply asks for your level of interest in a course like that if it were to be offered. Okay, David, back to you.
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks again. A recording of this event will be posted, and you all will get an email with a link to that recording in case you want to share it or in case you missed some of it. We had a couple of people that it sounds like they missed the beginning, and then again, if you want to hear more about this, we have some more offerings. But thank